The night was moonless, cloaking the world in an oppressive darkness. Deep in the heart of a forgotten town, hidden beneath years of overgrown weeds and crumbling trees, stood the abandoned Brookhaven Asylum. Local legend painted it as a place of unspeakable horrors, a place where tortured screams once echoed through the halls. Now it sat silent, its shattered windows like vacant eyes staring into the abyss of the night. Jacob, an urban explorer hungry for the thrill of the unknown, had heard the whispers. He had watched the grainy footage of others who had ventured close, none daring to step beyond the rusted gates. Tonight, with a flashlight in hand and a camera strapped to his chest, he intended to go further than anyone else had. The gates groaned as he pushed them open, the sound a discordant shriek against the silence. Every step toward the asylum felt heavier, the air growing colder as though the building itself exhaled a frosty breath. Jacob stopped at the entrance, his flashlight illuminating graffiti-covered walls and rotting wood. The door, barely hanging on its hinges, swung open with an eerie creak as he touched it. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound reverberating as though the walls themselves were mocking him. The flashlight beam swept over overturned gurneys, rusted wheelchairs, and crumbling patient records scattered like fallen leaves. The deeper he ventured, the stronger the sense of being watched grew. Jacob's camera picked up faint static, and he cursed, tapping it lightly. As he moved toward what appeared to be the main wing, a loud clang shattered the stillness. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Swinging the flashlight toward the sound, he saw nothing but a broken filing cabinet tipped over. He forced a laugh to steady his nerves. Just the wind, he muttered, though he knew there had been no breeze. The halls stretched endlessly, each turn revealing more of the asylum's decayed state. There were faint scratches along the walls, some resembling words, others claw marks. The words, "Help us," repeated over and over in jagged etchings. Jacob felt a chill snake up his spine. As he reached the basement stairs, an unnatural cold seeped from below. A sane man might have turned back, but Jacob was driven by something primal, a mix of curiosity and arrogance. The stairs groaned under his weight, the flashlight flickering ominously as though protesting his descent. The basement was worse than he could have imagined. Water dripped from pipes, forming stagnant pools that reflected the dim light. The air was thick, suffocating. Along the walls were rusted shackles, their purpose unmistakable. Faded bloodstains trailed along the floor, leading to a heavy steel door at the far end. He hesitated, but the thrill pushed him forward. The door was ajar, revealing a room bathed in darkness. As he stepped inside, his flashlight caught something on the floor. An intricate circle carved into the concrete, symbols he didn't recognize surrounding its perimeter. In the center lay a single gurney, its leather straps worn but intact. Jacob's breathing quickened as his flashlight flickered again, plunging the room into complete darkness. A whisper broke the silence. It wasn't a word, but a guttural sound that sent shivers through him. He spun around, the flashlight sputtering to life, casting erratic beams across the room. Shadows danced unnaturally, growing and shifting as though alive. "Leave," a voice hissed, low and resonant, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Jacob's legs refused to move. His camera now emitted a high-pitched whine, its screen flickering between static and blurred images of the room. The whispering grew louder, layers upon layers of voices overlapping until it became an unbearable cacophony. Suddenly, the symbols on the floor began to glow, their light sickly and pulsating. The shadows coalesced into a figure at the edge of the circle, its form humanoid but grotesquely distorted. Its limbs were too long, its eyes hollow voids that seemed to suck in the light. It stepped forward, and Jacob finally found the strength to scream. He bolted for the stairs, his flashlight swinging wildly. The whispers followed, growing louder with every step. He reached the ground floor and sprinted for the exit, not daring to look back. The asylum seemed to shift around him, hallways twisting and stretching as if the building itself sought to trap him. When he burst through the front doors, the air outside was no longer cold but stiflingly hot. He collapsed onto the overgrown grass, gasping for breath. Behind him, the asylum loomed, its windows now glowing faintly with the same sickly light as the symbols. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. Jacob scrambled to his car, his hands shaking so violently he could barely fit the key into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure stood at the gates, watching him with those hollow voids. It didn't follow. It didn't need to. Jacob never spoke of what he saw, but those who found his footage say the video ends with a single frame. The steel door slamming shut behind him, the symbols glowing brighter, and a distorted face filling the screen just before the feed cuts to black.
Story number 2.
The town of Black Hollow was barely a dot on the map, hidden deep within the woods, where the dense canopy swallowed sunlight even during the brightest of days. At its heart stood the Hollowmere Hotel, a sprawling structure built in the 1800s. Once a luxurious retreat, it had fallen into disrepair after a series of mysterious disappearances and deaths, earning it the nickname the Hotel of Lost Souls. By the time Sylvia and her friends heard of it, the hotel had been abandoned for decades. The allure of a haunted legend was irresistible, and so on a cold October night, the group of 5 set out with cameras, flashlights, and the reckless confidence of thrill-seekers. The building loomed before them like a sleeping beast, its once grand facade now covered in ivy and scars of decay. The entrance doors hung slightly ajar, as if inviting them in. As they stepped inside, the air grew thick with the scent of mold and something faintly sweet, too sweet, like rotting fruit. The grand lobby stretched out before them, its marble floors cracked and littered with debris. A massive chandelier hung precariously above, its crystals coated in decades of dust. Sylvia's flashlight beam swept across the space, landing on the concierge desk. The old guest book was still there, its pages yellowed and brittle. "Check this out," she said, flipping through it. The names were neatly written, but the final entry sent a chill through her. Checked in, the Sinclair family. Checked out, never. Classic horror movie stuff, joked Mark, one of her friends, but his voice wavered. They pressed deeper into the hotel, the silence amplifying every creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. Sylvia felt a constant prickle on the back of her neck, the unshakable feeling of being watched. The group moved cautiously, their flashlights carving paths through the darkness. On the second floor, they found room 213. Its door was slightly ajar, revealing a room frozen in time. The bed was still made, though the sheets were yellowed and brittle. A suitcase sat open, its contents untouched. Clothes, a pair of child's shoes, and a small, worn teddy bear. "Creepy," muttered Lisa, clutching her jacket tighter. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them with a force that rattled the walls. Their flashlights flickered. Panic set in as Mark yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Who's there?" he shouted in the oppressive darkness. The room grew colder, their breath visible in the dim light. The teddy bear on the bed shifted, slowly and possibly its head turned toward them. Its stitched eyes seemed to glimmer with malevolence. Sylvia screamed, and the lights cut out entirely. In the blackness, whispers began, soft at first, then louder, overlapping voices speaking in a language none of them recognized. The walls seemed to close in, the air heavy and suffocating. When the lights returned, the door was open. Without hesitation, they bolted, their footsteps echoing as they raced down the hall. But something was wrong. No matter how far they ran, the hallway stretched endlessly before them, looping back on itself. Mark collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. This isn't real," he stammered. "We're dreaming." But Sylvia knew it was no dream. The whispers had returned, louder now, coming from every direction. Shadows slithered along the walls, taking shape. They weren't human. Twisted, elongated figures with too many limbs and faces that seemed to shift and melt like wax. One of them reached for Lisa. She screamed as its fingers stretched unnaturally long, wrapping around her wrist. Sylvia lunged, grabbing her friend and pulling her free, but the creature's touch left a charred, blackened mark on Lisa's skin. The group ran blindly, their flashlights flickering uselessly. They burst into the ballroom, a cavernous space with a domed ceiling and shattered skylights. At its center was a long dining table, covered in cobwebs and set for a feast. Plates and cutlery were arranged as if waiting for guests, but the food was rotten, crawling with maggots. Then they saw them, the guests. Figures in tattered 19th century clothing sat around the table, their heads bowed. At first, Sylvia thought they were mannequins, but then one of them turned its head with a sickening crack, revealing hollow eye sockets and a skeletal grin. "Stay," it rasped, its voice like the grinding of stone. The other figures began to move, their movements jerky and unnatural as they rose from their seats. Sylvia and her friends didn't wait to see more. They sprinted for the nearest door, bursting out into the freezing night air. They didn't stop running until they reached their car. As they sped away, Sylvia looked back at the hotel. The windows glowed faintly, and in the light, she saw shadowy figures watching them leave. For weeks afterward, Sylvia was haunted by dreams of the hotel. She would wake in a cold sweat, convinced she heard whispers in the darkness. One morning, she found a charred handprint on her bedroom wall, the same mark Lisa had on her wrist. When she tried to call her friends, none of them answered. Visiting their homes, she found no sign of them, no belongings, no photographs. It was as if they had never existed. Sylvia was the only one who returned from the Hollowmere Hotel, but she knew she hadn't truly escaped. No one ever does.
Story number 3.
The storm hit suddenly, violent winds tearing through the trees and rain pounding against the dirt road. Jessica had been driving for hours, her phone dead and the GPS useless in the remote backwoods. The only light came from her headlights, cutting through the relentless darkness. She was lost, but she couldn't stop. Not here, not in the middle of nowhere. Then she saw it. Rising out of the forest like a forgotten relic was an old gas station. Its neon sign flickered weakly, spelling out "Last Stop" in faded letters. The windows were boarded up, and the pumps looked as though they hadn't been used in decades. Still, it was shelter. Jessica pulled into the gravel lot, her tires crunching loudly. She hesitated, staring at the dilapidated building. Something about it felt wrong. But the storm was growing worse, and she had no other option. She stepped inside, the door creaking loudly as she pushed it open. The air was thick with the scent of oil and mildew. The station's interior was as decrepit as its exterior. Dust-covered shelves, an ancient cash register, and a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. Jessica moved cautiously toward the counter. A map was pinned to the wall behind it, and she leaned in, trying to make out the faded lines. Maybe it could help her find her way back to the main road. The bell above the door suddenly jingled, though she hadn't heard anyone come in. She turned quickly, her heart hammering. The door was shut tight. The room was empty. She laughed nervously, brushing it off as the wind. But when she turned back to the map, she froze. A single red X had been scrawled on it, directly over the gas station. She hadn't noticed it before. A loud thud echoed from somewhere deeper inside the building. Jessica spun around, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Is someone there?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. Silence. Against her better judgment, she stepped further inside. There was a hallway at the back of the station, dimly lit and lined with doors. Each door was labeled with a number, though the paint had chipped so badly it was hard to tell what they once said. The first door she passed was slightly open, revealing a dark room beyond. She shined her flashlight inside, finding rows of shelves stacked with strange, rusted tools. Something about them made her skin crawl. The next door was locked. The third door was ajar, revealing a staircase descending into the basement. The air wafting up from below was damp and cold, carrying with it a faint, metallic scent. Jessica stepped back, every instinct screaming at her to leave, but then she heard it. A faint voice, whispering her name. Jessica. Her blood ran cold. She hadn't imagined it. The voice was low, raspy, and unmistakable. It came from the basement. "Nope, no way," she muttered, backing away. But as she turned to leave, the door to the station slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound echoed through the empty room, and the whispering began again, louder this time. "Jessica, come." She was shaking now, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She bolted for the door, pulling at it with all her strength. It wouldn't budge. The whispering grew into a chorus of voices, all chanting her name, growing louder and louder until it was a deafening roar. Then it stopped. The silence was suffocating. Jessica turned, and that's when she saw it. At the end of the hallway stood a figure. It was impossibly tall, its body wrapped in shadow, with limbs that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. Its face, or what should have been its face, was featureless, save for a wide, jagged grin that glowed faintly in the dark. The thing raised a hand, long skeletal fingers pointing toward her. "Run." Jessica didn't think. She bolted past the counter, back into the main room, and hurled herself against the door. It still wouldn't open. Behind her, the creature's footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate. Desperate, she grabbed a chair and smashed it against the nearest window. The glass shattered, and without hesitation, she climbed through, cutting her hands and arms on the jagged edges. She didn't care. She needed to get out. Outside, the storm had eased, but the air was heavy, the forest eerily silent. She sprinted to her car, fumbling with the keys before finally managing to start the engine. She peeled out of the lot, her tires kicking up gravel. As she drove, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The gas station was gone. The lot was empty, swallowed by the forest, as if it had never existed. But as she turned her eyes back to the road, she saw something in the distance, another neon sign flickering weakly. Last stop. Her hands tightened on the wheel, her knuckles white. No matter how far she drove, the sign kept appearing, growing closer each time. And somewhere, in the darkness, she could hear it again, the whispers, calling her name.
Story number 4.
The old Parker farm had been abandoned for decades. Hidden deep within the rolling hills of the countryside, it was a place locals avoided, muttering tales of tragedy and the things that supposedly roamed its grounds at night. Generations had passed since anyone dared to enter its decaying house, or the massive barn that stood like a sentinel of dread. But for Ethan, Sarah, and Mike, the farm was irresistible. It was the perfect place to test their courage and capture footage for their growing paranormal channel. Armed with cameras, flashlights, and a Ouija board for good measure, they set out on a cold November night. The driveway was overgrown, the house barely visible through the tangle of dead trees and vines. As they approached, their headlights illuminated the rotting structure. The house's windows gaped like empty eye sockets, and the front porch sagged under its own weight. Behind it loomed the barn, its enormous doors ajar, revealing an unsettling darkness within. "Creepy as hell," Mike muttered, adjusting his camera. "This is going to be epic." Inside the house, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of decay and damp wood. Peeling wallpaper hung in long, curling strips, and the floor creaked ominously with every step. Ethan shined his flashlight across a cracked mirror in the hallway, the glass warped and stained. His own reflection seemed distorted, his features stretched and unnatural. "Let's start in the living room," Sarah suggested, trying to shake off the eerie atmosphere. They set up their equipment, and Mike pulled out the Ouija board, a mischievous grin on his face. "Really?" Sarah said, rolling her eyes. "That's so cliché." "Come on," Mike said. "What's the worst that could happen?" They gathered around the board, the planchette in the center. Ethan hesitated before placing his fingers on it, but the excitement of capturing something real outweighed his nerves. "Is anyone here with us?" Mike asked. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the planchette jerked slightly. "Don't move it," Sarah snapped, glaring at Mike. "I'm not," he protested. The planchette began to slide, slow and deliberate, spelling out a single word, B-A-R-N. A chill ran through the group. Ethan laughed nervously. "Someone's messing with us." "Let's check it out," Mike said, already packing up the board. Despite her unease, Sarah followed, the camera rolling. The barn loomed larger as they approached, the air growing colder with every step. The wind whispered through the slats of the weathered wood, carrying with it a faint, rotten stench. Ethan pushed the door open, its hinges screeching loudly, and they stepped inside. The space was cavernous, filled with shadows that danced and shifted in the weak beams of their flashlights. Rusted tools hung from the walls, and old, rotting hay was scattered across the floor. At the far end of the barn, a ladder led up to the loft. "Something doesn't feel right," Sarah whispered. Mike ignored her, pointing his flashlight toward the loft. "Let's see what's up there." Reluctantly, they climbed the creaking ladder, their footsteps muffled by the hay-covered boards. The loft was empty except for a few old crates, but the air felt wrong, heavy, as if it were pressing down on them. And then they saw it, a series of symbols carved into the wood, strange and jagged, encircling what looked like a crude altar. On it lay a small, rotting bundle of sticks and fabric. Flies buzzed around it, the sound unnervingly loud. "Let's get out of here," Sarah said, backing away. But before they could move, the barn door slammed shut with a force that shook the entire structure. The flashlight beams flickered wildly as a low, guttural sound echoed from below. "What was that?" Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. The sound grew louder, a wet, dragging noise that sent shivers down their spines. They peered over the edge of the loft, their flashlights cutting through the darkness below. Something was moving in the barn. It was massive, its hunched form dragging itself across the dirt floor. Its skin was pale and glistening, stretched tight over protruding bones. Long, jagged claws scraped against the wood as it moved, and its face, if it could be called that, was a gaping maw filled with rows of jagged teeth. Two empty sockets stared up at them, oozing a dark, viscous liquid. Sarah screamed, and the creature's head snapped toward the sound, its mouth opening impossibly wide. "Go!" Mike shouted, shoving the others toward the ladder. They scrambled down, but as they reached the ground, the creature let out an ear-splitting shriek and lunged. They ran, dodging through the maze of tools and debris, the thing's claws tearing into the wood behind them. The barn seemed to twist and stretch, the exit always just out of reach. The creature was faster, its snarls growing louder, closer. Ethan tripped, crashing to the floor. Sarah turned to help him, but Mike grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. "We can't," she started, but her words were drowned out by Ethan's screams. She turned just in time to see the creature dragging Ethan into the shadows, his flashlight spinning wildly before going dark. His cries faded, leaving only the creature's wet, guttural growls. The barn door finally appeared before them, and they burst outside, slamming it shut behind them. The night was eerily quiet, the storm having passed, but the silence was worse. They ran to the car, fumbling with the keys. As the engine roared to life, Sarah glanced back at the barn. The doors were wide open now, and the thing stood in the entrance, watching them, its head tilted unnaturally as though memorizing their faces. As they sped away, Sarah clutched Mike's arm. "We can't leave him. We have to go back." But Mike didn't respond. He was staring at the rearview mirror, his face pale. Sarah turned and froze. In the back seat, just inches away, was Ethan. His face was twisted, his eyes dark and hollow. "Drive," he whispered, his voice low and wet, a grin stretching unnaturally across his face. And then he vanished.
Story number 5.
The Grey Hill Asylum had been abandoned for years, perched on a hill like a vulture overlooking the desolate town below. Once a facility for the mentally ill, it closed abruptly after a fire swept through its east wing. Rumors of inhumane experiments and strange occurrences plagued its history, and the town's residents gave it a wide berth. Some said the asylum still whispered at night. Emma, Kyle, and Rachel didn't believe in ghosts. They were thrill seekers, drawn to the asylum for the adrenaline rush and the chance to document its eerie halls. On a cold, foggy evening, they climbed the rusted gates and made their way inside. The main door creaked open with a sound that echoed like a scream. Inside, the building was a labyrinth of decay. Water dripped from the ceiling, and the walls were covered in graffiti and scorch marks. The smell of mildew and something faintly coppery hung in the air. Their flashlights illuminated peeling paint and old hospital beds, their wheels rusted into place. "This is perfect," Kyle said, setting up his camera. "Let's see if we can find the treatment rooms. That's where all the creepy stuff supposedly happened." As they moved deeper into the asylum, the atmosphere grew heavier. Emma thought she heard faint whispers, but chalked it up to the wind slipping through broken windows. Rachel stopped suddenly in the hallway, staring at a rusted wheelchair sitting in the center of the path. "That wasn't there before," she said, her voice shaky. "Come on, it's just an old chair," Kyle said, walking past it. But as they continued, Emma felt an unshakable sense of unease, like they were being watched. They found the treatment room in the East Wing, the heart of the asylum's dark history. Rusty medical instruments were scattered across the floor, and a gurney stood in the center, thus its leather restraints still intact. Strange symbols were scratched into the walls, along with the words, "They never left." Rachel's camera caught a flicker of movement in the corner of the room. "Did you see that?" she whispered, pointing her flashlight. "See what?" Kyle asked. "There was someone," Rachel began, but her voice caught in her throat as the air turned icy cold. The flashlight beams dimmed, and an oppressive silence fell over the room. Then they heard it, a low, rhythmic tapping. It echoed down the hallway, growing louder, closer. "Tap, tap, tap. What is that?" Emma whispered, gripping her flashlight tightly. Kyle moved toward the door, his camera aimed down the hallway. The tapping stopped abruptly, and the silence was deafening. Suddenly, the wheelchair from earlier rolled into view, its wheels squeaking loudly. It stopped dead in the center of the hallway, as if waiting for them. "Okay, we're done," Rachel said, backing away. "Let's go." But before they could move, the gurney in the center of the room began to shake violently. The leather restraints flailed like they were being pulled by invisible hands, and the symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. The tapping resumed, louder now, coming from all directions. Emma felt a hand brush against her shoulder and spun around, but no one was there. Her flashlight flickered, and in the brief moments of darkness, she saw shapes twisted, shadowy figures moving just beyond the light. "We need to leave," she shouted, grabbing Kyle and Rachel. They ran, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. But the asylum seemed to shift around them, the hallways stretching and turning in impossible directions. Every door they tried was locked, and the tapping followed them, now accompanied by faint, guttural whispers. As they turned a corner, they skidded to a stop. The hallway ahead was filled with figures, patients judging by their tattered hospital gowns. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow and black. They stood motionless, blocking the way. Kyle raised his camera, but the lens cracked as if struck by an invisible force. The figures began to move, their heads jerking unnaturally as they staggered toward the group. The whispers grew louder, overlapping voices filled with pain and anger. "This way!" Rachel yelled, spotting an open door. They rushed inside, slamming it shut behind them. The room was small, empty except for an old mirror mounted on the wall. Their reflections stared back at them, wide-eyed and terrified. But something was wrong. Their reflections didn't move. The mirror versions of Emma, Kyle, and Rachel stood still, their expressions twisted into mocking grins. Slowly, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, bones cracking audibly. Emma stepped back, her heart pounding as her reflection reached a hand out toward her, pressing it against the glass. The whispers turned to screams, deafening and unrelenting. The glass began to crack, spiderwebbing outward from the reflection's hand. And then the mirror shattered. The light from their flashlights vanished, plunging them into complete darkness. The screams stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of their ragged breathing. When Emma opened her eyes, she was standing in the middle of the asylum's courtyard, alone. The fog was thicker now, and the building behind her was silent and dark. Kyle and Rachel were gone. She stumbled toward the gate, her legs trembling. When she reached the road, she turned back for one last look. The asylum's windows were glowing faintly, and in each one she saw them, hundreds of hollow-eyed faces staring back at her. Among them were Kyle and Rachel, and then the lights went out.
Story number 6.
It was nearing midnight when Lucas found himself on the deserted mountain road. His car's headlights cut through the dense fog that had rolled in, making every curve feel like a blind leap into the unknown. His phone was dead, and the nearest sign of civilization was miles behind him. He cursed his decision to take the scenic route, especially as the fuel gauge dipped dangerously close to empty. Then, out of the mist, a figure appeared. Lucas slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as his car skidded to a stop. Standing in the middle of the road was a woman in a tattered white dress. Her head was bowed, long black hair obscuring her face. She didn't move, didn't flinch, as if she hadn't even noticed the car. Heart pounding, Lucas rolled down his window slightly. "Are you okay?" he called out. She didn't respond. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft hiss of the wind through the trees. Lucas hesitated, then stepped out of the car. "Miss, do you need help?" She lifted her head slowly. Her face was pale, almost luminous in the moonlight, and her eyes, empty, hollow voids, bored into him. Lucas stumbled back, scrambling into his car. He locked the doors and fumbled with the gear shift, but the car wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died, leaving him alone in the suffocating silence. When he looked up, she was gone. Lucas exhaled shakily. His hands trembled as he reached for the ignition again. Before he could turn the key, the back seat creaked. Something heavy shifted behind him. He froze, the hairs on his neck standing on end. Slowly, he adjusted the rearview mirror. A face stared back at him. The woman's empty eyes met his, her grin impossibly wide, teeth jagged and gleaming in the faint light. She leaned forward, her head tilting at an unnatural angle. "Why did you stop?" she whispered, her voice like dry leaves scraping across pavement. Lucas didn't think. He threw open the door and ran, leaving the car and everything behind. His feet pounded against the asphalt as he sprinted into the foggy woods, branches tearing at his clothes and skin. The forest was endless, every direction looking the same. And behind him he could hear her, the soft crunch of leaves, the rustle of fabric. Her voice, sing-song and mocking. "Lucas, why are you running?" He didn't remember telling her his name. The sound grew louder, closer. No matter how fast he ran, she was always just behind him. He tripped, sprawling face first into the dirt. When he turned over, she was standing above him, her face inches from his own. "Stay," she hissed, her hands clawing at his chest. "Stay with me." Her grip was ice cold, and the world began to blur. Lucas screamed. kicking and thrashing, but her strength was inhuman. Just as everything started to fade, there was a bright flash of light. Headlights. The sound of a truck's horn blared and the woman vanished. Lucas sat up, gasping for air as the truck's driver ran toward him. "What the hell are you doing out here?" the man shouted. Lucas could only point to the woods. The man looked, his expression shifting from anger to confusion. "There's nothing there, kid." Lucas didn't argue. He climbed into the truck, too shaken to explain. As they drove away, he glanced out the window at the dark forest. In the shadows, he saw her again, smiling. She raised a hand in a slow, deliberate wave as the truck disappeared down the mountain road. Lucas never took the scenic route again.
Story number 7.
The Lake of Echoes was a quiet spot, far removed from the hum of civilization. Surrounded by towering pine trees, its still waters reflected the moonlight like a sheet of black glass. Locals told stories about the lake, how it was cursed, how people who swam in it sometimes didn't come back, and how those who did were different. But for Mia, Ethan, and Claire, it was just another spooky legend, perfect for their weekend camping trip. They arrived at dusk, pitching their tents near the shoreline. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan lit a campfire, and they sat around it, passing marshmallows and telling ghost stories. "Do you know why they call it the Lake of Echoes?" Claire asked, her face flickering in the firelight. "Because sound bounces off the water?" Ethan guessed, grinning. Claire shook her head. "No, because they say the lake remembers every sound it's ever heard, every scream, every cry for help. And at night, when it's quiet, you can hear them." "Sounds like a load of crap," Ethan said, tossing a stick into the fire. "Let's test it," Mia suggested. "Yell something at the lake, see if it echoes." Ethan rolled his eyes but stood up, cupping his hands around his mouth. "Hello," he shouted. The sound carried across the water, fading into the distance. A moment later, it echoed back, faint and distorted. "Hello. See? Just normal echoes," Ethan said, sitting back down. But then the echo came again, quieter this time. "Hello." And again, barely a whisper. "Hello." The three exchanged uneasy glances. "That's weird," Mia said. "It's like it's repeating." "It's probably just some weird acoustics," Ethan said, though his voice wavered. Night deepened, and the forest around them grew eerily silent. The usual sounds of chirping crickets and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by an oppressive stillness. The fire burned lower, casting long shadows that danced like figures in the trees. "I need to use the bathroom," Claire said, grabbing a flashlight. "I'll be right back." "Don't go too far," Mia warned, but Claire was already disappearing into the woods. Minutes passed, then 20, then 30. "She's been gone too long," Mia said, standing up. "We should look for her." Ethan grabbed his flashlight, and they headed into the woods, calling Claire's name. The beam of light illuminated twisted branches and gnarled roots, but there was no sign of her. Just when panic began to set in, they heard it. A voice. "Help me," it whispered, faint and trembling. "Claire?" Mia called, running toward the sound. The voice came again, a little louder. "Help me." They followed it to the edge of the lake, where the water lapped gently against the shore. Claire's flashlight lay abandoned in the sand. "Claire!" Ethan shouted, shining his light over the water. Nothing. "Maybe she fell in," Mia said, her voice breaking. "We have to do something." Ethan waded into the lake, the cold water biting at his skin. "Claire!" he called again, and then he heard it. A whisper, right next to his ear. "Help me." He spun around, but no one was there. The water around him rippled, and a pale hand shot out, grabbing his ankle. He screamed, struggling to pull free, but the grip was impossibly strong. Another hand emerged, then another, until dozens of hands were clawing at him, dragging him under. Mia watched in horror as Ethan disappeared beneath the surface. She turned to run, but froze when she heard a voice behind her. "Mia." She turned slowly. Standing on the shore was Claire. But something was wrong. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were empty, black voids. Water dripped from her hair and clothes, pooling at her feet. "Claire?" Mia whispered, her heart pounding. Claire tilted her head, a smile creeping across her face. "Why don't you join us?" Before Mia could scream, the lake erupted. Dark, slimy figures rose from the water, their faces twisted and unrecognizable. They reached for her, their wet, gnarled hands stretching impossibly long. Mia ran, the forest closing in around her. The whispers followed her, echoing her name, overlapping and growing louder. She didn't stop until she reached her car, throwing herself inside and speeding away. When she finally dared to look in the rearview mirror, she saw them. Figures standing at the edge of the forest, their empty eyes watching her, and in the center Claire, smiling that same unnatural smile. Mia never spoke of that night, but she would wake up screaming, haunted by the whispers. And when she closed her eyes, she could still hear the lake calling her back. It always remembered.
Story number 8.
The Midnight Mall was a relic of the past, a sprawling structure that had once been the pride of its city. Decades ago, it was the place to be, shops buzzing with activity, laughter echoing in the food court. But over time, stores shuttered, customers vanished, and the mall became a hollow shell. When urban explorers started sharing stories about strange happenings inside, it became a dare. The brave or foolish would venture into its depths after dark, searching for proof of its haunting. Most came back with creepy stories, mannequins moving, whispers from empty corridors, or the faint sound of a child's laughter. For Maya, David, and Eric, it was the perfect adventure. Armed with flashlights, a camera, and a thirst for excitement, they decided to explore the Midnight Mall at night. They climbed through a broken window near the back entrance, their laughter masking the unease settling in their stomachs. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and dust. Their footsteps echoed off the cracked tiles as they moved past boarded-up storefronts. Some stores still had merchandise inside, faded clothes on racks, dusty shelves of toys, and eerie mannequins frozen in mid-pose. "This place is insane," David said, sweeping his flashlight around. The beam landed on a mannequin wearing a torn suit. "Creepy, but cool. Take a picture," Eric suggested, pointing his camera. The flash lit up the mannequin's hollow eyes, making it seem almost alive. Maya shivered. "Let's keep moving." They wandered deeper into the mall, reaching the central atrium. A rusted fountain stood in the middle, dry and littered with debris. Above it, a broken skylight let in slivers of moonlight, casting eerie shadows. "This is where they say the weird stuff happens," Eric whispered, setting up his camera. "People claim they've seen shadows move, heard voices." "Like that?" Maya interrupted, her voice trembling. They all turned toward the far end of the atrium. A faint sound drifted through the air, a high, childlike giggle. "You're messing with us?" David said, glaring at Eric. Eric shook his head, his face pale. "I swear I didn't do anything." The giggle came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of running footsteps. Maya swung her flashlight toward the noise, catching a brief glimpse of movement, a small figure darting around a corner. "Was that a kid?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It can't be," Eric said. "No one comes here anymore." Against their better judgment, they followed the sound. The footsteps led them to an old toy store, its glass entrance cracked but intact. Inside, rows of forgotten toys lined the shelves. Teddy bears with matted fur, dusty action figures, and dolls with glassy eyes. "Let's not go in there," Maya said, stepping back. But David was already inside, picking up a stuffed bear. "Relax, it's just junk." The bear let out a distorted squeak as he squeezed it. Then, from the back of the store, a doll's voice crackled to life. "Let's play." David dropped the bear, and the three of them froze. The doll's voice repeated, slower this time. "Let's play." Suddenly, the shelves rattled and toys began tumbling to the floor. The laughter returned, echoing all around them, growing louder and more distorted. David ran for the exit, but the glass door slammed shut, trapping them inside. "What's happening?" Maya screamed, pounding on the glass. Eric's flashlight flickered, plunging them into near darkness. In the dim light, the toys began to move. Dolls twisted their heads toward them, their lifeless eyes gleaming. Wind-up figures shuffled across the floor, their gears screeching. From the shadows, the small figure emerged. It was a child, or at least it looked like one. Its face was pale and featureless, its body wrapped in tattered clothing. It cocked its head as if studying them before pointing a slender, unnatural hand at David. "Stay," it said, its voice an eerie echo of the doll's. "Stay forever." David screamed as the figure lunged at him. Its hands stretched impossibly long, wrapping around his body. He was dragged into the darkness, his cries fading until there was nothing but silence. Maya and Eric bolted for the door, pounding on the glass with everything they had. Just as the toys began closing in, the glass shattered, and they tumbled out into the mall. They ran without looking back, their flashlights bobbing wildly. The laughter followed them, fading only when they reached the broken window and scrambled outside. Breathing heavily, they looked back at the mall. It was silent and dark, as if nothing had happened. "David," Maya whispered, tears streaming down her face. Eric grabbed her arm. "We have to go. Now." They never spoke of the Midnight Mall again, but both would wake at night, haunted by faint laughter and the sound of footsteps just outside their doors. David was never found, and some nights, when the moon was full, new stories would surface of a mannequin in a torn suit, its eyes following anyone who dared to enter.
Story number 9.
The Thornwood Orphanage had been abandoned for over 50 years. Once a place of refuge, it now stood as a crumbling monument to tragedy. Rumor had it that the headmistress, Miss Eliza, was a cruel woman, punishing the children in unspeakable ways. When the orphanage burned down in 1973, none of the children made it out. Some claimed the fire was no accident. For years, people whispered about strange sounds, children laughing, faint singing, and the sharp crack of a cane echoing from the ruins. But no one dared to enter. Until now. Jake, Hannah, and Liam were amateur ghost hunters, always chasing the next thrill. When they heard about Thornwood, they knew it would be their most terrifying adventure yet. Armed with flashlights, a camera, and a spirit box, they climbed through a broken window into the charred remains of the orphanage. Inside, the air was cold and damp. The smell of ash still lingered, even decades later. Burnt furniture lay scattered, and the walls were blackened with soot. A grand staircase, partially collapsed, led to the upper floors. "This place is creepy as hell," Liam said, scanning the room with his flashlight. "Perfect," Jake grinned, turning on the camera. "Let's see if the stories are true." Hannah held the spirit box tightly, her knuckles white. "We should be careful. This place doesn't feel right." As they moved deeper into the building, the faint sound of humming drifted through the air. They froze, listening. It was the tune of a lullaby, soft and haunting. "Did you hear that?" Hannah whispered. Jake nodded, switching on the spirit box. Static crackled as he asked, "Is there anyone here with us?" For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then, a child's voice whispered through the device, "Play with us." Liam's flashlight flickered, and they all turned toward the sound. A ball rolled out of the shadows, stopping at Hannah's feet. She gasped, dropping the spirit box. "Okay, this is getting too real," she said, backing away. But Jake was undeterred. "This is amazing. Let's follow it." They moved toward the hallway from where the ball had come. The humming grew louder, echoing off the walls. The hallway was lined with scorched doors, some hanging off their hinges. At the end was a large iron door, rusted but intact. "That must have been the headmistress's office," Liam said. The stories said she kept things in there. Jake pushed the door open with effort. The room inside was surprisingly intact, as if the fire had spared it. A desk stood in the center, papers strewn across its surface. On the wall hung a portrait of Miss Eliza, her stern eyes seeming to follow them. "Creepy," Jake muttered, aiming the camera at the painting. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them. Hannah screamed, and Liam rushed to pull it open, but it wouldn't budge. The spirit box on the floor crackled to life. "Naughty," a voice hissed. "So naughty." The temperature plummeted, and frost crept along the walls. The portrait of Miss Eliza began to warp, her painted face twisting into a grotesque grin. Her eyes blinked. "Nope, nope, nope," Liam shouted, pounding on the door. "Let us out!" The desk drawers flew open, papers swirling into the air. A cane, blackened by fire, rose from the desk, spinning in the air before slamming into the wall. A deafening crack echoed through the room, followed by the sound of children sobbing. "We need to get out of here," Hannah cried, clutching Jake's arm. The sobbing grew louder, mingling with whispers that filled the room. The words were indistinct, but the tone was accusatory, angry. The air felt heavy, pressing down on them. Jake pointed the camera at the spirit box. "Why are you here? What do you want?" The box hissed before a chilling voice answered. "Stay with us." The door flew open, and they didn't hesitate. They ran, their footsteps echoing through the hallway. But the orphanage had changed. The corridors stretched endlessly, twisting and turning, leading them in circles. The whispers followed them. Shadows darted in the corners of their vision, and the sound of footsteps grew louder, as if a crowd was chasing them. "Over here," Liam shouted, spotting a door that led to the outside. They burst through, stumbling into the night air. When they turned around, the orphanage was silent and dark, its windows staring back like empty eyes. "Did you get any of that on tape?" Liam asked, his voice trembling. Jake looked down at the camera, his face pale. The screen was black, except for one image burned into the frame. The face of Miss Eliza. Her eyes were wide and burning with rage. Jake dropped the camera and they fled, never returning to Thornwood Orphanage. But at night, they all swore they could still hear it. the faint sound of humming and the sharp crack of a cane, as if the orphanage was calling them back.
Story number 10.
Deep in the heart of the Appalachian wilderness, there was a place locals only whispered about, Ironwood Asylum. Abandoned for decades, the sprawling complex was hidden by towering trees and dense underbrush. A rusted gate marked the entrance, its hinges barely holding against the weight of time. It was said to have once housed society's most disturbed souls, but the truth was far darker. Lila, a freelance photographer, had always been drawn to forgotten places. When she stumbled across an online forum detailing Ironwood's history, she knew she had to document it. The stories were chilling, patients vanishing without explanation, screams echoing through the halls at night, and a final fire that claimed the lives of nearly everyone inside. Yet no bodies were ever found. Armed with her camera, flashlight, and a growing sense of unease, Lila set out alone. The hike to the asylum took hours, the trail narrowing until it disappeared entirely. By the time she reached the gate, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in shadows. The air felt heavy, as though the woods themselves were warning her to turn back. But she pushed on, determined to uncover the truth. Inside, the asylum was a labyrinth of decay. Mold crept up, crumbling walls, broken furniture littered the floors, and the stench of rot hung in the air. Lila snapped photos, each flash illuminating the oppressive darkness. She felt watched, though every time she turned, the halls were empty. The further she ventured, the more bizarre the atmosphere became. Her flashlight flickered, revealing words scrawled on the walls in faded red paint. "Leave while you can." The writing was uneven, almost frantic, and looked fresh despite the asylum's age. Lila's heart raced, but she told herself it was just an urban explorer's prank. In the basement, the temperature plummeted. Her breath misted in the air as she descended, the steps groaning underfoot. At the bottom, she found what appeared to be a makeshift operating room. Rusted surgical tools lay scattered, and the walls were adorned with crude drawings of twisted faces. In the corner stood a single, intact hospital bed with restraints. Lila aimed her camera, but before she could press the shutter, the door slammed shut behind her. Panic surged. She spun around, flashlight trembling in her hand. A low hum began to fill the room, growing louder until it became an unbearable screech. She dropped to her knees, clutching her ears. Then, silence. When Lila opened her eyes, she wasn't alone. A figure stood in the corner, shrouded in shadows. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the beam of her flashlight. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The figure stepped closer, revealing a gaunt, ashen face with hollow eyes and a mouth that seemed stitched shut. It pointed to the wall where a new message had appeared, written in dripping red. They never left. Adrenaline took over. Lila bolted for the door, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. The asylum seemed alive now, doors slamming on their own, whispers chasing her, and unseen hands brushing against her skin. She stumbled into the main hall, only to find the gate she'd entered through was gone. The asylum stretched endlessly in every direction. Desperation set in as she realized there was no way out. The whispers turned to laughter, mocking her. A deep, guttural voice whispered in her ear, "You're home now." The last thing Lila captured on her camera was a blurry, distorted image of dozens of faces staring at her, their expressions frozen in agony. When a search party arrived weeks later, all they found was her camera. The asylum remained empty, or so they thought. Locals still hear her screams on quiet nights, blending with the whispers of the asylum's lost souls. And the photos on Lila's camera, no one who's seen them has dared to return to Ironwood.